Foothills Library. Well, we're going to have another great afternoon of learning and actually, oh, that slide disappeared, but the summer solstice and its effect on civilizations around the world, their beliefs. And you, as well as I, have an opportunity to attend many of these programs, and they are, if you haven't been to other programs that we have, very interesting on a wide range of topics. But I'd like to take a minute before I introduce our distinguished presenter this afternoon and remind everybody that the library is a privately funded library. We get no municipal assistance. Everything you see here is from the generous donations of our patrons. And I invite you to become a member of our library. It, by the way, is no cost. If you don't have a library card, take a minute, go to the front desk after the presentation, and our very able volunteers will be happy to sign you up and give you a card. And I think you will find everything that goes on at the library very rewarding, whether you are attending these lectures or whether you are involved in other classes that we have, learning static, learning Tai Chi, you name it, we probably did it. Last year, by the way, between children's and adult programs, we ran just over 1,000 programs at the library. And it's, again, all because of the generous donations of people like you. So take a minute, and if you're not a member of the library, please sign up and get a card. It's well worth it. And now it's my very great pleasure to introduce our distinguished presenter this afternoon, Dr., and I'm reading because I don't want to mispronounce Sharonah Fredrick, who is the Assistant Director of the Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. And please join me in turning off your cell phone so that we don't interrupt the doctor while she is presenting. Dr. welcome.
I would also, before we begin, like to thank a friend and colleague of mine who not only brought me here, but is taking care of all of the logistics. Thank you very much, Angela, and that's the nice woman at the back there. And by the way, after the lecture, if you enjoy what you've heard, do please come to our desk. Angela will also help out with that. You can sign up for all of our upcoming events. We have many, many free events. We have a few that are paying, but reasonably priced. More of them are free. And also take a look at our line of historical fiction books, which we publish. And we also have the contribution box, but you can decide what you'll do with that after the lecture. Let me begin with a little bit of background about myself before we get into the legends of summer, because many people, when they hear I'm the Assistant Director of the Medieval and Renaissance Studies Center, assume that I'm dealing all the time with medieval English and French history. I am dealing with a lot of Latin American history. That is actually my focus. I'm originally from Latin America. Spanish is my native tongue. And part of our Legends of Summer are going to deal with the legends of people from the pre-Columbian period, before Europe came to the New World. So I have a very, very great interest in the cultures of the New World as well. When we say medieval and Renaissance, we're not only speaking about Europe. So if you're thinking knights and ladies, no, it's bigger than that. If you're thinking knights and ladies, that's a part of it. But the parts of Europe which I tend to deal with didn't have knights and ladies in them. They had wild Celts and crazy Vikings, so you're going to have a lot of Celtic and Norse as well, because I'm interested in those areas. And what that means is that the legends of summer that we're going to talk about now are not what you might think of as the more stereotyped medieval and Renaissance. We're going to deal with medieval and Renaissance, but we're going to deal with what are considered outlier cultures in Europe. And the Celts, and to a certain degree the Norse, also fall into that area. And of course, the legends of the peoples of the Americas, who have not disappeared and are still with us and are still quite active, including in the state of Arizona. One more thing I just want to say to you, when we talk about summer, the definition of summer is also very different depending upon where we are. So when we say legends of summer, I also want to thank somebody who's not here, who's our friend Kendra, who puts together the lovely PowerPoints for us. When we talk about summer, in some cultures we are talking about something that begins at the end of June. But in many cultures, including Celtic culture, and those would be the peoples of Ireland, Wales, the Isle of Man, Scotland, Brittany, Cornwall, and Galicia in the north of Spain, for them, summer, as it does for the Old Testament, where we also have two seasons, summer and winter, begins in May. So we're actually right on target if we talk about legends of summer in May. Because the great summer festival for the Celts was Beltane, which was actually celebrated on what you would now call the 1st of May. Again, in the Middle East, the Jews and later on the early Christians celebrated also two seasonal times. There was wet season and dry season. If you go down to Yucatan, in what is now central Mexico, one of the focuses of Mayan Indian life, there are two seasons, wet and dry. And the wet season ends at the beginning of May, and from May till around November, you don't talk to anybody in Yucatan about summer and autumn. That is irrelevant. It really is irrelevant because leaves don't change in jungle climates. It's a wet season and a dry season. So what I'm going to do here is to really use these definitions more of the two-season approach. And from that point of view, we have just begun our summer. According to the Celts, according to the Jews, according to the Norse, and according to the Hopi Indians. And Angela, can we have the next slide? Thank you. Because our technology has not kept pace with the 21st century. So the way we can change, thank you very much, the way we change the slides is by me having my colleague enslave herself. Our clicker isn't working, but that's okay. So, speaking of Celts, who are more Celtic than the Irish. I am not Irish, but I have a lot of Irish in my heart. I've always been very, very deeply interested in Irish culture and Celtic culture. Also because of its tremendous connections, and this may or may not surprise you, with biblical Jewish culture. I myself am a Sephardic Jew. And with Native American culture. And while the Irish do have stories, and this may just be Irish blarney, or it may be a memory of something that happened long ago, of the Celts sojourning actually with the children of Israel in the desert. It's the very famous 12th century Irish text. We think they probably did not have much contact with the Native Americans until the time of the discovery of the New World. But their calendar, the traditional Celtic calendar, has a tremendous amount of similarities with Native American calendars from the Southwest. That's not because of any mysterious connection. It is because the Celts, like the Native Americans, emphasized the philosophy that focused on nature and their closeness to nature. So if we take a look at this, this is the traditional Irish calendar. This is the calendar that was in use in Ireland during the quote-unquote pagan period, before St. Patrick Christianized the island in the 5th century. But St. Patrick was a very, very tolerant saint. The Christianization of Ireland did not occur in the very violent way that the Christianization of the New World occurred. And so St. Patrick allowed practically all of the pagan customs to continue to exist. He didn't even ask to change the names. So of course, you know, St. Bridget was the goddess Bridget. We didn't even change her name. And everybody knows she's both the saint and a goddess. So here we have the divisions of time. Now, take a look at Beltane. Okay, we have this 8-pointed star. I'll get to the significance of that in 1 second. But the two chief points on this star in Irish Celtic tradition are Beltane and Samhain. You pronounce that Samhain. Okay, Irish Gaelic, if anybody has ever studied it, has a whole interesting set of phonetical rules. So it's not Samhain. Okay, Samhain. And Samhain you may know of more now as Halloween. But these 2 points are very important on the Irish calendar. Bel here symbolizes flower, okay, and Tain is fire. So we have this beautiful word, flowers of fire, fire flowers. These two elements will be very important in the celebrations of Beltane, because this marks for the ancient Celts. By the way, this ceremony is still celebrated all throughout the west of Ireland, and very actively in Scotland, and also in Wales. So flowers and fire are the symbol of this new time where winter ends, and because remember we're speaking about northern countries, it's a very fierce winter. So the flower symbolizing the regeneration of life, the fire symbolizing light. And of course for the Celts and for their cousins the Norse, where the winters are very long, this idea of disappearing light, the light returning, is a sign of festivity. There's a very famous Spanish philosopher and artist named Victor Brosa, who describes sacredness and sanctity as life with ritual. And Celtic life, like Native American life, was a life with a great deal of ritual marking these passages in nature. The chief god of Beltane was the god of light, Lu, who in Irish tradition is also very important because Lu is the child of an intermarriage. Lu, who you spell L-U-G-H, okay, not L-E-W, not L-O-U, is the child of two warring factions, the Fomorian giants, the Irish just like the Jews. If you read the Old Testament, what do we say in Hebrew? There were giants in the earth in those days. Every ancient people, the Norse, many, many myths of the giants who actually precede the gods, the Jews, the Norse, the Celts, the Wadi Indians in Peru, all have stories of this race of giants that disappears. And the Irish, no less, of course. So the giants are called the Fomorians. And Lu is part Fomorian and part Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess Danann. Not the yogurt. Danann refers to a river that I'm sure you've heard of called the Danube. The Danube is actually named after the goddess Danann, and if this is surprising to anybody, please understand that before our friends the Celts get to Ireland, where they will create this wonderfully ritualized lifestyle, they were for at least 2,000 years, we know according to archaeological remains, in Hallstatt, which is in contemporary Austria. Okay? So Danube is also the river of the goddess Danann. Beltane celebrates then the union of opposites, the coming of the light, but also the merging of the two groups which fought over Ireland and which eventually merged in peace over Ireland. So Irish history back in the old days was a little bit nicer and less bloody than we know it has been, particularly in the 20th century. That also expresses an aspiration of the ancient Irish, which is the time of the beginning of summer, Beltane, the festival of flowers and light, would become a time of harmonious reconciling of opposites. This is the time you are supposed to either look for a new love, or turn a friend into a lover, or renew your vows with the person you're with. Now, if any of you, if you're going to go back a number of years, but it is a classic, so even though I wasn't born when it came about, I know the musical score, because it is a classic of American musical theater. Do you remember the musical Camelot by Lerner and Loewe? Do you remember a song in there, which I think Julie Andrews sang a bit better than Vanessa Redgrave in the film version, The Lusty Month of May? Why is May a lusty month? Okay, all of those references to May as a month of lust go back to the celebration of Beltane, in which sensuality is the third element together with flowers and fire. Now notice that its twin on the other side is Samhain, the beginning of darkness, cold, and the light of the moon. Beltane has the light of the sun, so it's connected with Lu. Samhain has the light of the moon, so it's connected with the goddess Bridget, who's a little bit more sinister. And if you know Bridget also as a Catholic saint, she's one of the harsher ones in the pantheon. It's Bridget who actually gouges out her eyes, so a young prince doesn't take her as a lover. She's a harsh goddess. She was a harsh saint. She is the patron of Samhain. Lu is the patron of Beltane. They go together. They are not considered opposites. In Celtic tradition, as in the native tradition of the Americas, as in Chinese tradition with yin and yang, these are complementary parts of the same reality. Don't look at it as the merging of opposites. They are not opposites. For the Celts also, there was no difference between life and death. Death is a passage into another existence, just as for the Hindus in India. Everything is simply a stage in one existence. So we have to get this idea of opposites out of our head. The eight-pointed star for both the Celts and the Mayan Indians and many other peoples of the ancient times who survived into modern times, that's a symbol of the planet Venus, which always interests people because it too is a symbol of duality, morning star and evening star. Thank you. Can we move now to the next slide? Okay. So we met. Let's go back to fertility.
There we go.
The stag god and male fertility. Now, we know, this is where it starts to get a little hotter. We know that in more than one way, that May, that Beltane, is the start of the lusty month of what would later be called May. In the Celtic calendar, then it actually begins to be called the month of May with the coming of Christianity and a Latin-based calendar. For the native peoples of the north and northeast of Arizona, and for the Hopi people, who are one of the most important of the nations that live in Arizona and a bit into New Mexico as well. This time, the beginning of the planting season, is also a time of fertility and love and lust. Okay, they go together. There is no denial of the physical aspect of love in either traditional Celtic or very living Native American tradition. In this room, when I came into it, I commented to Terry, what a magnificent collection you have of the images of the Kachina spirits, of the Hopi people in stained glass. It's absolutely beautiful representation. The Kachina spirits, one of whom you see pictured here, represent the forces of nature, and they are in fact the forces of nature who bring the rain, and bring the light, and bring the clouds, that allow the cycle of planting and irrigation to continue. For the Hopi people living very close to the earth, the Kachinas represent the different aspects of agricultural life. And the stag, for both the Native Americans and the Celts, is sheer sex. Now why? I can give you a very, very overly facile and obvious answer. He's horny. Literally. And we use that phrase in Spanish too, cornudo, which means with antlers. So, now what is the connection between antlers and sex? I don't know. But it's interesting to me that peoples all over the world have found this kind of double-ended joke to mean lustful for sex. And so the image here, we have a beautiful image of a young Native American man embodying the spirit of masculine sexuality. Okay? And for the Celts, Ceridwen, the god, and this is one of the gods shared by the Welsh and the Irish, by the way, two branches of the Celtic family. Ceridwen, the stag god, also represents sexuality. Now, if you think for a minute of the physical idea of a stag, and think of the power of the stag, and think also of the quickness of the male stag, you can start to understand why it would become a perfect metaphor for healthy and vigorous male sexuality. The young man with the stag horns is a young Hopi who has passed the rite of initiation, and he is now considered of the age in which he can found a family. Because I want to stress this point. We're not talking about wild orgies. We are talking about a really mature appreciation of your own sexuality. Enjoy the sexuality and enjoy it responsibly. Because this young man will now have to protect the family and protect his children. So it is not the idea of sex with no responsibility. This beginning of summer for both the Celtic and the native peoples of the Americas symbolizes not only the enjoyment of sensual sex, that is there, but the appreciation of its responsibility, because his chief task now will be the protection of his family. Remember also, if you're observing a stag in the wild, that a male stag, just as a female bear, will fight to the death to protect their young. And that includes fighting animals who are far bigger than they are. So a male stag will fight a male bear to protect his young. Now the native peoples have always had a profound respect for nature. I dearly wish all the rest of our culture had it. And they do not view animals as inferior. The term for the animal is the four-legged brother. And you can learn from studying the animal kingdom. By the way, if you eat, sleep, drink, and breathe, you too are an animal. We are ourselves mammals. Science often tells us what ancient people already knew. In traditional Celtic thought, and also in traditional Norse thought, the animal was also not an inferior. And just as with Native Americans, everyone had their power animal. And you could gain the strength of that animal, or you could lose that strength. In summer, and our summer we now know begins for the Hopis at the beginning of the planting season. That's the beginning of our calendar of May, or Beltane for the Celts. That is the month of summer. Next slide. Thank you. This is a particularly beautiful image. If you don't know it, I want you to, because this artist is one of the most magnificent of the pre-Raphaelite artists of 19th century England. His name is E.R. Hughes. I would dearly recommend, if you forget everything I say in this lecture, please remember his name, because looking at his art, you will discover a world of creativity connected with this theme. E.R. Hughes was born in Birmingham, and in the mid-19th century, a movement had grown up in Birmingham, which was fascinating because it incorporated things you might not think go together, and yet they went together very well. These artists fought for workers' rights and better salaries for artisans, because you might find it hard to believe that being an artist was considered a very lowly profession if you worked with your hands. That's actually a very silly tradition that developed in the High Middle Ages. If you were a sculptor, that was considered a menial form of art. Because you imagine calling Michelangelo's sculptures or Donatello's sculptures menial forms of art. But it wasn't until the Renaissance, really, that sculpture was appreciated. In Birmingham, which was a big industrial area in northern England, artists were considered like bricklayers. But you know what E.R. Hughes said? He said, yes, and bricklayers themselves are artists. Have you ever seen a well-built house? That's nothing to sneeze at. This movement begins fighting for better workers' rights and also resurrecting forgotten mythologies. And I'm referring specifically to the mythologies of the Celts and the Norse that had originally been a big part of English literature throughout the Middle Ages and the Renaissance, and in the 19th century began to be, I would say, discounted as quote-unquote serious literature. They were just stories. We now have this rather highfalutin definition of serious literature. As E.R. Hughes pointed out, Shakespeare was inspired by this, not by serious literature, and you know that if you've ever read A Midsummer Night's Dream. Who, tell me, has the right to define what is serious literature? Okay, when I was a very small child, we used to get in Argentina dubbed into Spanish Masterpiece Theater, coming from PBS. You remember Alistair Cook? So you haven't lived until you've seen him in Spanish. Where to dub him into, now I want you to see the way this was done, to dub Alistair Cook into Spanish, because he had, you know, an exceedingly elegant English accent, which of course made all the Americans think, oh my God, I'm such a stupid American, he speaks so beautifully. They had to do the same thing to us in Argentina. So of course, he was speaking like a Spaniard with a lisp. So Alistair Cook was speaking Castilian Spanish. And, you know, masterpiece theater with the great works. And this is something which as an anthropologist I find quite hilarious, because the definitions of highbrow and lowbrow culture are very relative. And Shakespeare, who we all recognize as the greatest writer in the English language, if we could resurrect Shakespeare, he'd be with us right here saying, give me these folk tales, because if you read his plays, you know that he loved Celtic stories and magic. Shakespeare was a writer who used to go into pubs and get into brawls with his chief actor, Richard Burbage. They would throw drinks at each other. We know during rehearsals they would throw chairs at each other. Is this highbrow? So E.R. Hughes and these painters, and I know you've heard this phrase, they called themselves pre-Raphaelite painters, went back to this wonderful heritage, which they wanted people to be well paid for while they painted. And they resurrected these myths. And so we have this magnificent picture, and it is just one of many magnificent pictures of E.R. Hughes representing Midsummer's Eve. Now let's talk a little bit about what this represents, and let's also just draw your attention to the image, which I think is absolutely stunning. So you're looking at a small fairy. Where does this word fairy come from? There is a theory posited by the Irish anthropologist of the 19th century, Kathleen Briggs, that the word fairy, referring to that beautiful type of little sprite, actually had its origins in biblical Hebrew. Now, when I first read that, because I know Hebrew, I thought she must be out of her mind. No, she isn't. Because there is a word in Hebrew, which was used much more in biblical than in modern Hebrew, called the word is lifaer, which means to make beautiful. But it is a word generally only applied to angels and seraphs. And as Kathleen Briggs pointed out, one theory of angels and fairies that was very popular in the early Middle Ages in England and Ireland was that the fairies were actually fallen angels. Is that a possibility? I don't know. Nobody has come up with a better explanation for that particular word, why that word is chosen in English and in Irish Gaelic. The word for a fairy in Spanish is hada, which comes from a Greek root meaning magic. And as Celtic culture goes into its golden age in Northern Europe, and as Mayan Indian culture goes into its golden age in Central America, we hear another term called the Dark Ages. But this is not a dark period. If you're a Native American or a Celt, this was your great period. And as the cultures grow and develop, the concept of summer extends. And while we see that for both Celts and Native Americans, midsummer itself, began in May, they both, interestingly enough, begin to celebrate another festival, Midsummer's Eve. And the native peoples here, have you ever been to New Mexico and seen Chaco Canyon? Okay, will actually orient their buildings along with the lines of the summer solstice, so that when the sun comes up on what is June 22nd, June 21st, there are certain shadows cast reminding the people we are now in the middle of summer. We're in the middle of the planting season. In the Celtic world, Midsummer's Eve, which some of you also may know of, we know of it in Spanish as La Noche de San Juan, right? St. John's Eve. Although Spanish Jews, we generally just call it La Noche de Magia, right? The night of magic, because we can't call it St. John's Eve. But it's specifically a time of supernatural events, celebrated in Spain still on June 24th. Midsummer's Eve during Shakespeare's time would have been celebrated on June 22nd, which was bingo, the solstice. So E.R. Hughes then, painting in the 19th century, goes back and looks at all of these magnificent legends and finds that on Midsummer's Eve in the Celtic and English countries, this is the time when the fairy people, the little people, these magical sprites or these fallen angels, come out of their portals. It almost sounds like an extraterrestrial world. They come out of fairyland and they are very, very active on that night. Now you understand why Shakespeare centered A Midsummer Night's Dream in midsummer. Okay? What is the significance of the solstice? People imagine in both the American Southwest, if you are a medieval Hopi, on this hottest and longest day of the year. Imagine if you are in Northern Europe and you're either in the Celtic lands or the Norse lands where sun is scarce. And a friend of mine in Norway, an anthropologist I worked with many years ago, once said to me, you know, when that big yellow disc comes up in the sky, we run away. We don't know what it is. So its appearance, right, in that the land of the midnight sun, you're going to appreciate this idea of the vigor of the sun. For the Hopi people, it's when the Tiwa Kachina, there he is, no, I did not place him there, he was there before I came. That's the sun god, the one I'm pointing to right here, the one closest to my hand. Tiwa, the sun god, and for the Celtic and Norse people, the sun itself, originally represented by the Germanic goddess Suna, which is where you get the term sun from. This is a time of great rejoicing, the long light, because they know the dark period is coming soon. For the Hopis with Tiwa, well, you know yourself what sunlight is like at the end of June here in Arizona. And it is a time when they say Tiwa tries their patience. And I'm sure you will agree. To stand outside on June 21st, all day long. Tiwa will be trying your patience. The planting and the harvest, of course, for both the Celts and the Native Americans constituted the axis of their existence. Now, let's go back to E.R. Hughes's beautiful picture of, is she a sprite herself? She's actually a young woman, looking at the little fairies dancing. I don't know if you can see very well. If I shut off the light, could somebody there maybe shut the light just for 1 second so you can see the picture better? Thank you very much. Thank you. Okay, now can you see the little people? And now it really looks magical, right? This looks very beautiful. Maybe we'll just leave the light off. Are you okay with that? Yeah. We can see it all better. Yeah, that was kind of magic the way it happened. This young woman is entranced by the fairies, the meeting of the human and the fairy, the melding of magical and not magical. Imagine what this meant in dirty, sooty, industrial Birmingham. By rescuing this heritage and putting it in the most beautiful visual terms, E.R. Hughes and the pre-Raphaelites were also registering a very strong social protest, because most of these stories were of Irish and Welsh origin. And in 19th century, rather imperialist Victorian England, and the U.S. was also on an imperial score there, here in the West, right? This is the end of the Age of Empire, begun in the 16th century, coming to its head in the 19th. To celebrate the cultures that had been discounted because they'd been conquered was registering a very strong political protest. So I introduced this artist to you if you don't know him, and I hope you will continue to take a look at his very beautiful renderings of the summer and winter solstices. This is what you should see if you come out of your house on between June 21st and June 24th at midnight. So you'll tell me if you see a bunch of dancing, you'll be there. Or you see her walking around. Next picture. And so, a Midsummer Night's Dream. We know that Shakespeare knew a lot of Celtic folklore. And we know that because in the 16th century, in the area that Shakespeare was born in, Stratford-upon-Avon, in whose forest he was arrested because his family was hungry and he robbed a deer at age 16. Do you know that? Well, it's a good kind of reason to think that sometimes you have to judge a crime in accordance with what the social circumstances are, because Shakespeare should have been thrown in prison at that point. But a very intelligent queen decided, and please remember this is before Shakespeare was Shakespeare, that if his family didn't have enough food, the response would be to improve the granaries so the poor would have a place where they could get food and not imprison him. That's why Shakespeare did not go to prison. Thank you, Queen Elizabeth Tudor. Okay, so it's just something to think about. That area was an area with a very, very strong Celtic and Saxon folklore. And, you know, through the Middle Ages, because of course here we're speaking about the mid-16th century, supposedly, first the Catholic Church and then the Anglican Church in the 16th century, would have stomped out the remnants of this quote-unquote pagan belief, but they never did. And we find that so many people in England and so many people in Ireland would do exactly what the Indians in Mexico and Peru would do when they were conquered by the conquistadors. They would fuse their religion with the conquering religion. And so all of these supposedly pagan stories survive under another form. And the same way the ancient Celts and the ancient Saxons who conquered them would have gone into the forest on Midsummer's Eve to light the fires, so do those beliefs come up again in all of Shakespeare's plays, because they were still very, very much alive. They are still very much alive. So Celtic folklore was part of Shakespeare's intellectual background. So much for Alistair Cook and his separation of high literature and low literature. There is no separation. If you really study literature, that's what you'll see. Midsummer's Eve is always centered around the forest. Please remember that still in Shakespeare's time, the forest itself had wild animals in it. You know that it wasn't until the end of the Middle Ages when lions were completely exterminated in Europe. There were still lions in mainland Europe, not a lot, but some throughout the Middle Ages. And if you read many of the stories of the courtly knights from the High Middle Ages, from the 12th to the 15th century, you will read of occasional encounters with lions. Think of how many of the kings of medieval Europe of the High Middle Ages, when I use that phrase I'm referring to the 12th through the end of the 15th century, had lions on their shields, right? The rampant lion, that was a symbol of the House of Plantagenet in England. They still existed. They are completely exterminated by the end of the 15th century. What you still had, however, in large quantities, and they were far more frightening than lions, because they tended to attack human beings much more than lions, were wild boars. And if you go throughout, particularly northern England, the amount of statues of wild boars that you're going to find at the entrance to churches and castles is astonishing. Particularly if you're in the area around Mercia, in kind of the Midlands in England. So the forest is a place of fear, but it's also a place where you go when you're rebelling against an unjust social regime and you're stealing from the rich to give to the poor. So if you're Robin Hood, you're in the forest of Sherwood. And if you're Shakespeare, you're also stealing for your starving family in the forest of Arden. Arden, of course, for Shakespeare also had a very, very profound connection because his mother was named Mary Arden. Okay, so the forest of Arden was very connected to Shakespeare's physical memory as a child and to his mother's family. And I will tell you, along with the English scholar Michael Wood, I would agree with Michael Wood, that it's very probable that when Shakespeare was a young boy, he saw some of these ceremonies going on. He would have seen them even more as an older man, because Elizabeth Tudor was far more tolerant than any of her predecessors or any of her successors regarding religious pluralism in England. Although officially, the only religion in that time would have been Anglican Christianity. During Elizabeth's time, we know that Elizabeth was very lax on persecuting Catholics. We know that her favorite musician was John Dowland, who was himself a declared Catholic. So she did not carry the Catholic-Protestant enmity over into Britain. We know that she allowed Spanish Jews to come and settle in England when they fled the Inquisition. She was a very, very unusual woman. And we know she wasn't bothered by all the pagan references in Shakespeare's plays. Because please remember who Shakespeare's main patron was. It was she. And there is no play more pagan than A Midsummer Night's Dream. And she loved it. She particularly loved that play because this was a great time for Elizabeth. She had defeated the invincible Spanish Armada. She had made peace with the Irish pirate queen, Grace O'Malley, in the year 1593. And I posit to you that it is not accidental that this play, which has the chief spirit of the Irish midsummer celebration, the puka. So what do we call him in the play? Puck. Right? The puka is this crazy spirit that can change shape. I don't think it's accidental that following the peace made between Elizabeth Tudor and Grace O'Malley, you have this beautiful upsurging of Irish folklore on the English stage. So you understand the role of the forest because that's where the fires were lit for the Beltane ceremonies. And of course the tree itself representing the world tree, which is a belief that the Mayan Indians have, the Hopi Indians have, the Norse have, and the Celts have, called Yggdrasil, right? The world tree. And it's also in Kabbalistic Judaism called Eitz HaChaim, the idea that the entire universe is supported by a kind of symbolic tree of life. And next picture. Now, right next door to you, we have a very, very powerful site called Chaco Canyon. Chaco Canyon in the high Middle Ages of the Southwest was the site of a very powerful empire, or rather a powerful kingdom that strove to be an empire, dominated by the Anasazi people. The Anasazi people have not disappeared, okay? Please forget those crazy History Channel documentaries that talk about, they've disappeared, it's mysterious. No, they haven't disappeared. They live right with us. They are the Zuni Indians. When the Anasazi kingdom collapsed, there was a social reorganization, and those who survived the collapse went off and became the people we now call the Zuni Indians. So nobody disappeared. Mayan Indians also haven't disappeared, folks. There are 6 million of them, and I worked with them for close to 10 years as an anthropologist. So it kind of kills me when I hear the History Channel saying, where did these people go? They went nowhere. They're right in front of you now. Take a flight down to Cancun. You will be surrounded by Mayan Indians. They didn't disappear. Neither did the Anasazi in the Southwest. What changed was the social organization. And in the 12th century, the Anasazi, like the Mayans a few hundred years before, were at the height of their very powerful city-state confederation. But apparently at one point, Chaco Canyon, that particular branch of the Anasazi kingdom, began to dominate the surrounding city-states, and it led to a lot of problems here in what we now call Arizona and New Mexico. And the other states rebelled. There was a huge uprising, and Chaco fell. Now, if you ever visit New Mexico and you visit the Chaco Canyon ruins, they're extraordinary. They are just as you would have had in Europe. The native people were building the equivalent of castles and fortresses, just as in ancient Europe. It was a society with a great deal of violence, and they fought each other, and they were every bit as nasty to their neighbors as Europeans were. The human genome does not change, for better or for worse. The buildings in Chaco Canyon followed the summer and winter solstices and the spring and autumn equinoxes, even though, as you know yourselves in the Southwest, we really couldn't talk about 4 seasons back then either. It was still 2 seasons, but they did recognize a change in the sun's position and the position of the planets. You are looking here at an image of, that's a beautiful image, of the daylight moon, which you can see in Chaco Canyon on the summer solstice. Now, if you go throughout the Southwest, it kills me when I hear people saying, there's no ancient history in the Southwest. You know, the history of the native peoples here goes back at least 5,000 years. And up in the high desert in Colorado, I worked in a wonderful place there called Crow Canyon. Which also, by the way, for anybody interested in doing archaeology, but you're not willing to commit as an archaeologist, but you want to have a brilliant 2 or 3 weeks, you can join the digs in Crow Canyon. They are looking at native culture that goes back 6,000 years. So to say we have no ancient culture is to tell me that person doesn't know the Southwest. The Southwest is a pretty amazing place. And in the Southwest, the native peoples of the Middle Ages, the ancestors of the ones who are with us now, built their buildings in accordance to a sky map. They were following different constellations, and the buildings reflect the layout of the skies. They also reflect the changes of the planets through the seasons. And that is why through certain windows, you will see Venus at certain times of the year. And through other windows, you will see Mars. Because the map of land was basically reflecting, or better put, it was a smaller microcosm of the macrocosm of the sky. And that's what you would have seen here in Midsummer's Eve. And you'll see it again if you go to Chaco Canyon on June 24th. When everybody in Spain is celebrating La Noche de San Juan, in Chaco Canyon, the Hopi people will take you around to see what they call the daylight moon. That's Midsummer's Eve in the American Middle Ages. Next picture.
Can we possibly turn the lights back on for those of us who would like to be able to see you?
Yeah, oh, I'm the picture of everything.
A little lip reading is helpful sometimes.
You know, let's leave half of them if you wouldn't mind. I want to leave half off because you're really not seeing the beauty of the pictures, and you'll see me. Yeah, I'm going to ask. I'm sorry for the but you'll see me. I'm not that spectacular. I'm good. I'm not spectacular. And I do want you to see the pictures. I apologize, but the pictures here I want to take precedence over me. Now, what is the connection with flowers and the heavenly bodies? We've spoken about the planets. We spoke about the flower as a symbol of, the new planting, right? It's summer. And we saw that the original meaning for Beltane is essentially flower fire, right? For both the native people and the Celtic people, it's just wonderful to see these parallels. And something that as an anthropologist has always fascinated me. The connections between Celtic and Native American folklore. The flower in both of the folklore represents literally stars that have come to Earth. So we have this Earth-sky connection. And in Incan stories, now come with me down to closer where I'm from, which is Argentina. The Incas were, as we know, in northwest Argentina. Peru, Ecuador, Bolivia, and even into southern Colombia. They got very far. In Incan tradition, there are many, many stories of what they call star maidens, who are beautiful women from the skies who come to Earth in the form of flowers, and then, of course, fall in love with mortal men. And we have the same beautiful stories you'll find in European folklore of the supernatural woman and the mortal man. And sometimes it ends tragically, and sometimes we make up happy endings. We can't stand the tragic endings. But this story of people mixing with the gods of the stars is a very, very common theme. And so if in Incan myths we have the star maidens, and in the midst of the Guarani people of Paraguay and northeastern Argentina, we have the stories of the daughters of the moon, who also come to Earth in the form of a plant that we drink all the time in Argentina. It's called mate. Okay, we're actually drinking the daughters of the moon. That's their gift to us. In Irish mythology, the gods also come down from the sky, down from the stars as flowers, and they are the people of the goddess Danann. And you see the way everything's coming together? The Tuatha De Danann, the people of the river goddess. Of course, the river is tremendously important. Remember that in Irish tradition, the oldest goddess is actually called Banya, and you might know of her more by the English mispronunciation of Boyne. Remember the Battle of the Boyne? Where the Pope sold out the Catholic Irish when they fought Protestant King William. History is a very funky thing. It's a very bitter memory in Irish history, very, very bitter. And one of the reasons it's bitter, apart from the fact that most of the Catholic Irish did feel betrayed by the fact that the Pope took the role of a Protestant king, which should just show you that all politicians are always what they always are. Let's not even go there, because we know what they remain. All of them, irregardless of religion, party, or whatever. That's a politician, whatever is most convenient, right? But it had another bitter meaning for the Irish, because for them the source of their culture was Banya, okay? The river. All life comes from the rivers. Of course, in Arizona, the native peoples, the Hohokam, the ancestors of our friends, the Tono Oda, who live with us in Tucson, also created these great irrigation canals, right? By rivers. Society begins by rivers. Remember ancient Egypt as well, okay? So the river is a source of life. And the Tuatha De Danann, the people of the goddess of the river Danube, also descend into Ireland from the stars. The sky garden and sky ships. This is a very, very beautiful idea. We find in both Native American and Celtic mythology for the Mayan Indians, for the ancient Maya and for today's Mayan Indians. Heaven is a beautiful mountain presided in the sky by their world tree, which is just the best of all the world trees, because for the Mayans, their world tree is the chocolate tree. The cacao. I don't know where you guys are going when you get out. Absolutely, it's a chocolate heaven. If you don't know, folks, have you ever seen chocolate growing? Sometimes when people come down from North America to South America, they're always shocked to see the chocolate forests. Chocolate grows on trees. And the cacao bean is, of course, this very large fruit, which in native tradition represents the woman's breast, its fertility. And for the Mayans, the sky garden, this beautiful garden of chocolate in the sky, it's fantastic, right? Comes to fruition and sheds its fruit during the summer. Of course, this is when you can actually pick the cacao beans right off of the tree. There was no chocolate in Europe until the conquistador Hernán Cortés drank it for the first time in what was left of the Mexico he wrecked. I think standing on the bodies of bleeding Aztec Indians said, "Ay, qué buena bebida." And then it comes into Western culture. But when you drink chocolate in the New World, you're drinking it, and this is the New World, you're drinking it where it was created. And by the way, I have the good fortune to tell you that archaeological finds made 2 years ago in Chaco Canyon proved to us that the Indians of Chaco Canyon were trading with our Mayan brothers in Central America, because what did they find in Chaco pottery from the 12th century? Theobromide cacao, the remains of chocolate. It is a sign of any advanced civilization. Next slide. I think we will have no debate on that. And somebody please tell me the time, because I cannot quite see the clock. Tentatively, okay, so we're totally on track, but we also want to leave some time for questions, which I hope there will be. Now let's go back to the old world, new world. Well, you know, the lines may not have been quite as harsh between the old and the new world prior to the beginnings of that nasty thing called empire. It starts in the 16th century and reaches its world height in the 19th. You know that there are many, many stories of Irish explorers going out to the west and finding a place they call in Irish Gaelic Tír na nÓg, which means the land of youth. Could that have been the Americas? Could have been at least Greenland. We know that before Columbus set sail from the port of Palos in Spain, he had visited Ireland. I don't know if anybody, do you know this? Columbus visited Ireland in 1490. And he visited the city of Galway. And in Galway, this is one of the most interesting episodes in the life of Columbus, he is shown the remains of 2 bodies that had washed ashore in what for the Irish they said was a strange boat, because it looked like a curragh, the traditional Irish sailing boat, but it wasn't quite that. It was probably a canoe. And Columbus described these bodies. The way he describes them, I think they were 2 bodies of, unfortunately, people who had died by being thrown off current. I think they were the Inuit people, who we commonly call the Eskimos from Greenland. Because apparently the coats that they were wearing were still there, and that would be the equivalent of an Eskimo parka, according to the descriptions of them. So what I'm telling you is that ocean currents blow people off. And there could have been some unintended contact between Old and New Worlds. But let me also remind you that the Vikings were in the New World. We have the Viking settlement in Ansel Meadows in Nova Scotia, where we know that Vikings lived together with the Iroquois Indians for close to about 30 years. Wow. And that's an established settlement, Ansel Meadows. And if you want more information about that, I can give it to you after the lecture. But what's really, really exciting is the archaeologist Patricia Sutherland, who 3 months ago has now found very conclusive proof of something she's been saying for the past 20 years. that there was a longer period of Viking settlement where they lived very peacefully with the Cree Indians up in the area around Baffin Bay. It was called by the Indians Ungava Bay. And that has been conclusively discovered now, so we now have that second major Viking settlement. What I'm telling you is that there was interchange on a limited scale. Without getting into that whole story, because it's another story, I do want you to see that stories do go back and forth. And I have a feeling that one reason that the Vikings may have lived really fairly pacifically with the native peoples is that their own mythology and their own religion was not that different from the very deep and profound native appreciation of nature. Stonehenge. Is this an example of Celtic mythology? Is this Celtic archaeology? There are so many theories about Stonehenge. I'm going to take what I think is really the only relevant one, and I'm going to be really boring and take this from the university that's doing all the excavations in Stonehenge, which is Birmingham University. And Birmingham University right now is leading in English archaeology. They also unearthed one of the greatest treasures of Anglo-Saxon England called the Staffordshire Hoard. A fantastic collection of gold and garnet, which I saw half a year ago. Go and see it. And the archaeologists of Birmingham University are kind of famous in England because they do pioneering work, and they're willing to test quote-unquote crackpot theories, but they test them in a very, very academic way. So they can tell very quickly, are they true or are they not? Now, one thing they were testing here in Stonehenge, no, they were not testing did Merlin the magician build it. They know Merlin didn't build it. Do any of you remember, well, they're classics of English comedy, Monty Python? Okay, you know John Cleese, who once, when he was doing his takeoff on the typical BBC presenter, was analyzing the question, was Stonehenge built from whales? As you know that the rocks are from quarries in northern Wales. And he showed this image of all these cute little whales. It's very silly, but many people know. So Merlin did not build it, you know. But the recent archaeological finds show something absolutely fascinating. As opposed to the theories that this was an isolated area that people only went to on the summer and winter solstices, that was what the mythology was telling us, not the Celtic mythology. That's what modern day, quote-unquote, academic mythology, by people who write papers and get tenure, and then don't want to analyze new theories when they challenge their tenure. That's a real problem we have in archaeology, okay? That is what the standard view was until, thank heavens, some more enterprising academics from Birmingham University said, you know, this is an awfully big structure for people to just go to 1 or 2 times a year. And they looked back in older stories, older Celtic and Saxon accounts, that spoke of there being large villages in this area. And then they did what good archaeologists do. They started digging. You know what they found. They have found huge habitational complexes, only a half a mile down from Stonehenge, including very, very large graveyards, which shows us that this was a living community, and that Stonehenge was the temple of that living community. Okay, so let us please end these theories that this is where aliens came. They did not build it. Yes, it was built with stones from quarries in Wales. That should not shock you if you know more and more about Celtic culture, as we are finding in Ireland and the British Isles through archaeology. The Celts had massive trade networks. Even the Romans commented on that, although the Romans said, oh, the Celts are very disorganized. Their trade networks go all over the place. I can tell you that's what a good trade network should do, actually. But the Celts had a kind of crazy quilt spiral ordering of their trade networks, which I personally enjoy. They could bring rocks. They could bring rocks from quarries. This was not unthinkable, particularly when you remember that the origins of Celtic culture are in Hallstatt, in Austria, in rock and salt quarries. Okay, so yes, every midsummer, including this midsummer, you'll see a bunch of people dressing up like happy-pappy druids, you know, dancing through the stones. And that's wonderful, they don't hurt anybody. And please remember, this was not some mystical temple nobody touched. This was a temple that was very much in use. From what the University of Birmingham is found till now for at least 600 years before Christ. Okay? It may have been abandoned shortly after due to agricultural reasons. That is most of the time the reason for abandonment or political upheaval. It's possible it was abandoned during the time that the Romans came to Britain. But up until that period, this is the temple of a heavily inhabited site. Okay? So when you come up to Stonehenge, don't be fooled by the fact that, oh, it looks uninhabited and you have this attitude of mystery. No, folks, we found everything in Stonehenge, including human remains, and that includes everything. I'm not going to go into it. People were living there. We have to get some of the 19th century romanticism out of our heads. This was an operating temple, which operated, of course, on Midsummer's Eve. And the graveyard is literally about 2.5 miles walking from Stonehenge. From that, the University of Birmingham has proved that at least 9 generations lived in that area. Okay, so much for it being isolated. It wasn't isolated. Next slide, please. Thank you. Thank you very much, Angela. Now this is really interesting again in terms of midsummer mythology. Merlin, of course, Myrddin, as he is called in his Celtic incarnation, Arthur's either prophet or seer, King Arthur. Which Arthur? King Arthur I'm talking about, the Celtic chieftain, who may be a composite of 5 Celtic chieftains who lived in Wales and fought the Saxons and what was left of the Roman Empire at that point. He supposedly had an advisor, according to the oldest Arthurian epic in English, because you have others in Welsh that are older, and you actually have older ones in French, but I'm thinking of Geoffrey of Monmouth's History of the Kings of Britain. He has Myrddin, or Merlin as we will call him, as an advisor and as a bit of a prophet for King Arthur. And in later stories, of course, he becomes also a magician and a sorcerer. Taliesin, a magnificent Welsh bard of the 6th century, who wrote one of the greatest of all poems in Welsh, The Madness of Merlin, very beautifully translated into English in the 16th century. These stories tell of somebody named the Green Man. You see this figure in a lot of mythology in the Celtic countries and throughout medieval Europe. Who was the Green Man? Well, according to Taliesin, that was Merlin himself. Because his story was that Merlin had gone mad from watching the horrible warfare between the Celts and the Saxons. So Merlin's a kind of nice person who doesn't like to see people killing each other. And he lost his mind and went to live, where does he go to live? In the forest. And who goes looking for him? Arthur's foster brother. 10 points for anybody who knows that. Anybody know the Arthurian story? His foster brother, because Arthur is brought up, remember, by foster parents. It's an interesting aspect of the legend. He's not brought up by his father, Uther Pendragon, and his mother, Igrania. That's a whole other story. He's raised by foster parents. So he has a foster brother named Sir Kay. And Kay goes looking. Kay and Arthur have this kind of funny, sharp-tongued relationship. Kay is referred to as the sharp-tongued. But he and Arthur, according to the stories, and I hope they're true, they're probably not, but I hope they're, loved each other very much. And Kay kind of takes care of Arthur's behind-the-scenes work. So Arthur, being king of the Britons, doesn't have time to go looking for Merlin. Kay goes looking for him. This is Taliesin's story. And Kay finds Merlin, having lost his mind, looking like, Kay says, "You're a green man." He's become overgrown with leaves himself. This is the image of the wild man. Yeah, the part of European culture that was untamed, maybe the part that was still pagan. Okay? And Kay stays with Merlin and tries to cure him of his madness. And Taliesin has a beautiful lesson for us in this poem. Kay finally cures Merlin of his madness when Merlin is able to help another human being. So the idea is kind of you can come out of your own, you can heal yourself when you help someone else. It's a kind of beautiful idea. Is that connected with midsummer? Yes, indeed. Because one of the major figures of the midsummer celebrations, and now you know when I say midsummer, I'm referring to the end of June. Right? or St. John's Eve, as it's called in Spain. One of the main figures is the Green Man, and that is Merlin, when Merlin is cool. Okay. The Green Man is also viewed as a living tree. Now here you have a Celtic illustration. It's actually by a modern-day Irish artist called Lizzie McBourne, who lives in County Kerry. And she visualizes Merlin, the Green Man, as a tree himself. See the tree arising, the roots from his brain. Well, welcome to South America, where we have the same idea of the tree as the living ancestor. And in Quechua, the language of the Incas of Peru, we call it Malki. And there's something fascinating about that word, because we only use the term Malki one other time, and that's when we refer to the mummies of the Inca kings. Now the Incas, like the ancient Egyptians, although they were centuries apart, the Incas are a medieval culture. They begin in 12th century Peru, and they last until the Spanish conquistador, Francisco Pizarro, comes and destroys their kingdom. But they also had the belief, and their descendants, the Quechua Indians, had the belief that the king's bodies, the kings were the sons of the sun. So the summer solstice in Peru is very important, except you know when our summer solstice is down there? It's when you have your winter solstice. So summer solstice in Peru and in Argentina, where I'm from, is December 21st, right? So it's upside down, or you're upside down up here. Well, everybody's upside down. Malki is the term for the royal mummy, and it's also the word for tree in Quechua. And that's a fascinating thing, because what that shows us is, here comes a really snotty academic word, the conflation. What does conflation mean? Remember when I first started going to university in the US, I thought, my God, when I become an academic, I never want to be as pretentious as this particular professor who was talking about conflating everything. Because I didn't know that particular word. I finally asked the professor, I think it was in the 3rd class, what does conflate mean? And he said, oh, it just means joining together. So maybe you could have defined that, because I realized that it wasn't just me as a second language English speaker, but most of the native English speakers had no idea what conflating was. So all conflating means is joining together. Okay, so now you know this. Now you can do academic pretentious speaking as well. So ask your friend, have you conflated that yet? So it's just joining together, that's all it is. So the conflation of those two terms, the royal mummy and the world tree, is fascinating because it shows us the belief in ancestors, the tree as an ancestor. And you will be told in Peru by the native peoples, and again, I wish we would adopt this belief all over the world, be careful with nature because they are your oldest ancestors. You are part of this cycle of life. By the way, you'll be told that by a modern-day physicist as well. Okay, this is all one life cycle. We like to say human beings have been given dominance over the rest of it. That makes us feel better. But we're born, we die, we become part of the cycle of life. Yeah? So the Malki is your holy ancestor and the living tree. Merlin, the Green Man, is the Celtic remembrance of that idea as well. And the trees are your living companions. You know, there's a saying in, it was a saying originally among medieval Jews who lived in what is now Germany and what is now Spain, called in Hebrew Ashkenaz if you were in Germany, and Sepharad if you were in Spain, that to be complete, you had to do three things. You had to raise a child. If you didn't have a child of your own, you had to teach a child. You had to write a book. And you had to plant a tree. Okay, so this closeness to the tree as a living ancestor, you'll find in many, many cultures. If you have heard of the Dead Sea Scrolls, Jesus also often refers to his teachings as the tree upon which people, from which people can learn. So the tree, well, trees also, can I remind you, give us air. That's pretty important. And next slide. The eagle kachina. And the eagle kachina is right there. Thank you. Thank you very much. Behind, okay, so the one farthest down on my right-hand side, that's the eagle kachina, you see with those magnificent eagle wings. For the Hopi in the summer ceremonies, the eagle is tremendously important. The eagle, of course, is the sign of the sun. The eagle is the bird that incarnates the force of the sun. And for the Hopis, the eagle also has a very important symbolic meaning in terms of wisdom. When a Hopi medicine man, or woman, because it can be a woman too, wishes you eagle vision, what they're wishing you is a vision that sees the big picture. Think of the way the eagle glides and senses its prey down at the bottom of the canyon and swoops in. So may you have the clarity of the eagle's vision, may you be able to get what you want, the way the eagle does, and the eagle kachina symbolizes the power of the sun and the force of that vision. Sun gazing. Now this is a very interesting practice you find among many native peoples. The Mayan Indians have it, the Hopi Indians have it, and lo and behold, doing some reading, I just discovered that the ancient Druids in Ireland also had it. It was training the eye to be able to look at the sun for longer and longer periods each day. Now, I know some of you are going to say, and this is true, staring at the sun is not good for your retina. I'm not recommending that you do this without being trained in it. But I will tell you that there are very ancient traditions that continue today among the Mayan Indians in Central America, among the Hopi Indians here in Arizona, and New Mexico, and in Western Ireland, particularly in the town of Killorglin, which is where a very famous fair is held called the Puck Fair. Puck, the puka. Okay, it's fantastic. They put a goat up on this gigantic stick and they all dance around it. That's one of the Beltane ceremonies. You know, you call it the maypole. Right? So dance around the goat. And sun gazing is a discipline which is practiced in order to develop concentration and mental strength. It is still done, and the people who practice it under these circumstances do not show any retinal damage. Okay, that doesn't mean I'm telling you tomorrow go out and look at the sun, because you will damage your retina. But what a number of scientists are looking at now is, of course, the mind-body connection. And is it possible to do this sun gazing in the incremental way in which they do it without damaging the retina, because we have proof of it in the west of Ireland, Central America, and Arizona. It is one of the ceremonies of midsummer. And midsummer, of course, marks the point where we all pray to the eagle kachina to bring back the rains, which I'm sure you'll sympathize with, particularly at the end of June, when you're ready to take your skin off your skeleton and hang it up, because it's so hot. That's the eagle. Now, my colleague Kendra, who's not here, but my colleague Angela will also laugh when she sees this picture, because I have to confess, I have used this picture in about 14 PowerPoints since I came to Arizona State University, which is a little bit less than 2 years ago. Because she could be a Native American, she could be a Celtic princess, she could be Queen Guinevere, she could be anything you want her to be. This is from a series of fantastic illustrations by the American illustrator Howard Pyle, who was very deeply influenced by the English artist E.R. Hughes. And what Pyle did was to look at Celtic tradition, look at Native American tradition, look at Norse tradition, look at biblical tradition, and create this magnificent series of children's books whose axis are the illustrations. Celtic moon goddesses and the midsummer solstices, well, that is actually what that is supposed to be, is the goddess Vivian, and now we move from Ireland to Wales. And Vivian, for those of you who don't know, is also, in some of the Arthurian stories, the woman who bewitches Merlin and has him fall asleep for over 1,000 years under a rock in Brittany, in northern France. So that's who that picture is. I've used her for everybody from Pocahontas to Queen Esther. She's kind of one picture fits all. That is Howard Pyle's image of Vivian. Okay, one of the Welsh ladies of the lake. And the ladies of the lake, water, moon, in Celtic mythology are connected. Now remember, everything in the Celtic world, like everything in the Native American world, is a series of dualities of sun and moon, life, death, rebirth. During midsummer, the moon goddesses are not at their height, but they're lurking in the back. And that's part of the kind of sensual and sexual tension. Midsummer is when you celebrate male masculinity. But I always thought Viviana's kind of smiling because she knows, yeah, we'll wait 6 months. We come back. And of course, the swan as an image of the moon goddesses. You find this all through Welsh and Irish mythology. Everything connected with the moon and its changing phases, migration, return, all of this is weakened during midsummer. But Vivian, or as we know in her Irish name, Nimue, is viewed as the eternal goddess whose different phases simply revolve and wait. So that's what she's doing. This is what Vivian does during the midsummer festivals. She waits because the period of the precedence of the moon, meaning female energy, is coming right around. So masculine energy, summer. Feminine energy, winter. Feminine energy is connected with the moon, darkness, the lesser light, but Vivian seems to think it's a more efficient light. Fertility, wetness, water. Masculine energy connected with light, warmth, the sun. And so in all of these cosmologies, and I'm also thinking particularly in Inca cosmology, in Latin America, we have the idea of the sun god. In the case of the Incas, it's Inti. In the case of the Irish, it's Dagda, penetrating the female earth. So in Irish mythology, Dagda penetrates Banya, the river goddess, and that's the beginning of life. Okay? The gods and goddesses form a cycle. Everything in Celtic tradition is cyclical. Everything in Native American tradition is cyclical. There is no end of life. There is simply transformation of life. We're getting close to the end, or shall I say, just another phase of our presentation. Shakespeare. Let's go back to Shakespeare. We are really all a bunch of idiots. And you know who says that, of course? The puka in A Midsummer Night's Dream. That's Puck. When Puck is going around like a madman, remember making this one fall in love with that one and just laughing at what idiots people are. Really, Lord, what fools these mortals be. Shakespeare himself is an example of that duality. You know, in Hamlet, he says, what a piece of work is man, how infinite in reason, right? And then here is, what a bunch of schmucks. Both of them are true. Both of them are true. Shakespeare lived that duality. So we are very happy to come to you and give these lectures. We hope that you will do two things before you leave. And we're not going to leave yet because right now we have time for questions. One of them is to sign up for our future events. And when I say our, I'm referring to ACMRS. We hope to do some future events here in Cave Creek. This is wonderful. This is the first one we've done here. We have a very, very active roster of events all year long. You can ask some of us who know me. I'm seeing some old friends here in the audience. And they will vouch for it. So everybody jump on Fred. He's attended many of our events, and he'll tell you they're pretty good. And sign up for them. And we certainly hope to be back in Cave Creek. It's a very beautiful library. So that's our sign-up sheet. And if you can manage to give a gold piece or two, it would be nice. That's our green, in honor of the green man, contributions box. And then on the table itself, we have images. We have examples of Bagwin Books, which is a wonderful imprint for historical fiction, which is historically accurate, which was founded by our colleague Kendra, who's not here today because she's on a well-deserved vacation, but you'll meet her eventually too. Angela, thank you for all your help. Questions? Questions? There should be at least one question.
Center for Medieval Studies.
Yes.
Are they...
For medieval and Renaissance.
Is that associated with the ASU? Or is it
Yeah, we're in ASU. We are part of ASU.
ASU.
We are an integral part of ASU, and because we are a research center, we're very interdisciplinary. So our activities will embrace everything from Norse literature to Latin American colonial history, everything. Yeah, we're global. So it's a wide berth.